It was 5:43 in the morning when I walked out onto the porch and felt it. Not rain, heat. The kind that settles in before sunrise and tells you the day is already lost before it starts. The forecast had been sitting on my kitchen counter for 2 days. 100 degrees Tuesday, 102 Wednesday, 104 Thursday. 3 days of that, back to back, during the exact week my corn was silking. I didn't panic. I went inside, opened the irrigation app on my tablet, and checked the pivot status. All 12 pivots, all online. Dashboard green across the board. I went back to bed. That was my first mistake. My name is Marcus Whitfield. I'm 48 years old. I farm 640 irrigated acres in central Nebraska, corn mostly, with a small block of soybeans on the east side. I've been doing this for 22 years. I know what heat stress looks like, I know what pollination failure costs, and I know, or I thought I knew, that my pivot irrigation system would handle anything the summer could throw at it. About 3 years ago, I switched to a cloud-based smart irrigation platform. The salesman was convincing and the technology was real. The system monitored soil moisture at 4 depths, tracked evapotranspiration data from a local weather station, calculated plant stress indices, and automatically adjusted pivot speed and water application rates. I could control every pivot from my phone. I could be standing in a grocery store in Grand Island and restart a pivot on the other side of the county. It cost me $47,000 to install across all 12 units, plus a $40 $200 annual subscription. Worth it, I decided. Convenience, efficiency, precision. Convenience works, until it doesn't. I woke back up at 7 a.m. and made coffee. Opened the app, still green. I had 2 pivots scheduled to run that day on the sandy 80-acre block on the south end of my operation. Those 80 acres had always been my problem ground. Sandy loam over coarse sand. Low water-holding capacity. In a normal year, that ground needs careful management. During pollination, during a heat wave, that ground is a liability. I'd planted it to corn anyway because the price justified the risk. Corn running around $6 a bushel that summer. Potential yield if everything went right, 180 bushels per acre. Potential disaster if it didn't. Catastrophic. I drank my coffee, watched the app show green on every screen, and drove out to check the fields by 8 a.m. Standard morning routine. I noticed the leaves on the southern 80 before I even got out of the truck. The corn was already rolling. Tight, stressed rolls on leaves that should have been broad and flat at 8 in the morning. I walked 2 rows in and looked down at the soil. Dry. Not bone dry, but dry enough that a plant hitting 104 degrees that afternoon was going to struggle. The pivots hadn't run overnight like they were supposed to. I pulled out my phone. App showed all systems normal. I stood in that field for probably 3 minutes, just staring at my phone. The app was showing all pivots as operational. Current status, running or on schedule. No alerts, no error messages. Green lights on every unit. But I could see pivot 9 from where I was standing. It wasn't moving. I drove to the south field. Pivot 9 was stationary, no water flowing. Pivot 11, the other unit assigned to that block, also stopped. I tried to restart them from the app. The command registered as sent. The pivot didn't move. I tried again. Same result. I drove to the panel box on pivot 9 and tried to engage it manually. The panel was dark. Not just off. Dark. The local controller had no display, no indicators, nothing. And I realized then what had happened. These pivots, this entire generation of smart pivot controllers, required a live authentication handshake with the cloud server to enable motor operation. It was a security feature. It prevented unauthorized remote access. It also meant that if the server went offline, the pivot couldn't verify its credentials and it simply wouldn't run. Not from the app, not from the panel, The hardware was physically present and electrically connected. The motors were fine, but without server authentication, the pivots were locked. The server was down, and the app, running from cached data, was still showing me green. I called the support line at 8:41 a.m. They answered on the fourth ring. "We're aware of an outage affecting irrigation management systems in several regions," the representative said. His voice was calm, scripted. "Our engineering team is working to restore service." "When?" I asked. "We don't have an ETA at this time." I sat in my truck next to a pivot that couldn't run in a field where the corn was already stressed at 8 in the morning with 104 degrees forecast for the afternoon. No ETA, no timeline, no workaround offered. "Is there a way to bypass the authentication?" I asked. "That would require a field technician visit to reconfigure the local controller. We can schedule..." "How soon?" "Our earliest availability is Friday." Friday was 3 days away. I had corn in pollination on sandy ground, with 3 consecutive days of extreme heat starting today. I thanked him and ended the call. Here's the math I did right there in my truck. I didn't need a calculator for most of it. I've run these numbers 100 times in different forms. 80 acres of corn in pollination. Heat stress at 104 degrees without adequate water does predictable damage. Pollen viability drops sharply above 95 degrees. Silk desiccation accelerates. The fertilization window closes. Conservative estimate of yield loss under 3 days of heat stress with no irrigation on sandy ground, 30 to 40 bushels per acre. Call it 35 in the middle. 80 acres times 35 bushels times $6 per bushel. $16,800. That's what was sitting in that field, at risk, right now, while a server somewhere in a data center was offline and a support rep was telling me Friday. I drove home. I sat at my kitchen table with a legal pad and tried to think through every option. Rent a portable pump and set up surface irrigation. But I didn't have the pipe inventory for 80 acres, and sourcing it would take 2 days. Call my dealer about emergency service on the pivot controllers. Same answer. They were backed up and this was a software issue anyway, outside their scope. Wait for the server to come back online. Possible. But I had no timeline and every hour the heat was building. Then I thought about the shed. My father-in-law, Gene, had farmed this ground before me. Gene died in 2014 and left me the operation along with 2 barns, a machine shed, and an assortment of old equipment I'd kept meaning to sort through and sell. Sitting in the back corner of the north machine shed, under a section of old canvas and about 10 years of dust, was a diesel irrigation pump. A big one. Gene had used it in the late 80s and early 90s before the pivots were installed. It pulled from the irrigation well on the south property and could move serious water volume through portable aluminum pipe. I hadn't looked at it in at least 8 years. I drove to the shed. The pump was a 1994 John Blue unit, 6-inch discharge, powered by a 4-cylinder diesel engine. It sat on a steel frame with 2 transport wheels, still hitched to one of Gene's old tractors. A faded green 40-20 that looked like it hadn't been started since the Clinton administration. I pulled the canvas back and walked around the setup. The pump itself looked intact. No obvious corrosion on the discharge housing. The impeller shaft turned by hand, stiff, but it turned. The diesel engine was another question. I checked the fuel tank. Dry. I checked the oil. Brown sludge needed changing. The fuel filter was opaque, which meant it was clogged. The fuel lines felt stiff but not cracked. This was a project, but it wasn't a junkyard. My phone buzzed. I checked the irrigation app out of habit. Still showing, all systems normal. I set the phone face down on the workbench and started pulling the fuel filter. It took me the better part of 4 hours to get that pump ready to attempt a start. I changed the oil, replaced the fuel filter with a spare I found on a shelf above Gene's old workbench. Still in the box, still sealed. I drained what little old fuel remained in the lines, cleaned the primary filter bowl, and filled the tank with fresh diesel from the farm tank outside. Then I bled the fuel system manually, cracking the injector lines one at a time to push air out until I had solid fuel at each injector. By noon, the temperature had hit 97 degrees. I tried to start the engine. It cranked. Strong battery. I'd pulled one out of an old service truck and swapped it in, but it wouldn't fire. Cranked and cranked. Nothing. I went back through the system, checked the shutoff. It was in run position. Checked the throttle linkage, moving freely. Checked the fuel solenoid on the injection pump. It was energizing when I turned the key. I cracked the injector lines again and cranked. Fuel was making it to the injectors, but still nothing. I sat back on a bucket and thought about it. Air in the high-pressure side. The secondary fuel filter, internal to the injection pump, was probably full of air and old varnish residue. I looked for a priming pump lever, found it on the left side of the injection pump body, underneath a bracket. Manual primer. I worked it for 5 minutes, pumping until resistance built, and I heard fuel moving without air burble. Then I cracked the injector lines, pumped the primer again until I got solid fuel weeping at each line, tightened them back up, tried the key. The engine fired on the second crank. Rough and smoky, running on whatever residual lubrication was left in the cylinders. But it fired. I held it at low idle for 10 minutes, watching for leaks, listening for bearing knock, checking the oil pressure gauge that Jean had mounted on the frame. Pressure came up. Temperature came up slowly. The smoke cleared. The engine settled. The pump was alive. But now I had a different problem. It was 1 p.m. The temperature had hit 101. The corn in that south field had been sitting without water since the previous evening. I needed to get water on those 80 acres, and I needed to do it with a pump that moved water through aluminum pipe in a series of runs. Not a pivot that covered a full circle automatically. This was going to be slow, manual, exhausting labor, and I was going to be doing it through the hottest part of the day. I called my neighbor Dale Fessler. Dale is 67 years old and farms ground adjoining mine on the west side. He also lost irrigation capability that morning. He has the same platform I do, same server dependency, but when I called him, he told me he was waiting for the system to come back online. No ETA, I said. I talked to support this morning. They won't even give a window. They'll get it fixed, Dale said. These things always come back. In how many hours? He didn't answer right away. I'll wait, he said finally. My ground holds water better than yours. He wasn't wrong about that. His soil was heavier. He had more buffer. But he was also betting 3 days of heat stress against a support ticket with no ETA. I didn't argue with him. I went back to the shed and started pulling aluminum pipe. By 3 p.m., I had the pump running at the south well and water moving through the first set of pipe runs. The setup wasn't efficient. I was running about 25 acres on the first pull, which meant I'd need to reset the pipe layout 3 times to cover all 80. Each reset was physical labor, pulling 30-foot sections of pipe, moving them, reconnecting, repositioning the risers and sprinkler heads. The temperature hit 103 at 4 p.m. I worked the field in that heat, moving pipe, watching the corn. The plants on the first runs started to relax within an hour of water hitting them, leaves uncurling slowly, color coming back to the margins. It was subtle. You'd have to know what you were looking for. But I'd watched corn my whole life, and I could see it. I called support again at 5:30 p.m. Different representative. Same answer. No ETA, engineering team working on the issue. I asked specifically about a manual override procedure for the pivot controllers. She put me on hold for 11 minutes and came back to tell me there was no field bypass procedure available to customers. The authentication system couldn't be disabled locally by design. By design? I repeated. Correct. For security purposes. Control shouldn't depend on a server. I thanked her and ended the call. By midnight, I had 2 of the 3 pipe layouts complete and running. My arms were dead. My back was done. I'd sweated through 2 shirts. The temperature at midnight was still 89 degrees. I sat next to the pump engine in the dark and just listened to it run. The diesel engine had never missed a beat all afternoon and evening. Hour after hour, load after load. It just kept running. No server required, no authentication, no subscription, no app. You put fuel in, you prime it right, it runs. Jean had understood something about reliability that I'd been paying a subscription fee to forget. I checked my phone. The app had finally updated. At some point in the last few hours, it had registered a connectivity error and now showed a warning banner. Some system data may be unavailable. Contact support. The pivots still showed as scheduled and operational, which was simply wrong. But at least the false green was gone. I topped off the diesel tank from a 55-gallon barrel I'd dragged out with a tractor. Checked all the pipe connections in the dark with a flashlight. Found one leaking coupler and banged it tighter with my palm. Set my phone alarm for 3 a.m. and slept in my truck for 2 hours. Wednesday morning, day 2 of the heat wave. Forecast, 104. I was back at the pump before sunrise. 3rd pipe layout reset took me an hour. I was slower, more sore, but I had the routine down. Water was on all 80 acres by 7 a.m. I drove the rows of the sandy block and checked the plants carefully. The first 25 acres I'd watered the previous afternoon looked good. Silk was still viable, leaves were open and tracking the sun, no visible tip burn. The last sections I'd reached around midnight looked more stressed. Some tip burn on the outer leaves, some silk desiccation at the tip ends. But the plants had water now. The question was whether I was early enough. I drove over to Dale's ground around 8. His corn on the lighter soil sections was visibly struggling. Leaves rolled tighter than mine had been yesterday morning. He was standing at the edge of the field looking at his phone. "Still nothing?" I asked. "Just got off the phone with them," he said. "They said potentially this afternoon, maybe this evening." That was 30-plus hours after the outage started. His corn had been without water in 100-degree heat for a day and a half. "You need anything?" I asked. He shook his head. "I'll be all right." I wasn't sure he would be, but there was nothing I could do except go back to my own field. The outage ended at 4:17 p.m. on Wednesday, 36 hours after it began. My phone lit up with notifications. All 12 pivots reconnecting, authentication confirmed, system status updating. Within 8 minutes, the cloud dashboard was fully operational, all pivots responding to commands. I watched Pivot 9 and Pivot 11 both restart automatically per their stored schedules. I felt genuine relief, and underneath the relief, something else, something colder. For 36 hours, my entire irrigation infrastructure had been inert. Not because of mechanical failure, not because of a power outage or a broken pipe or a burned motor, because a server was down, because the authentication handshake that my $47,000 system required to function couldn't be completed. All the hardware was fine. All the pivots were physically ready to run, but they couldn't move without permission from a computer they couldn't reach. And meanwhile, Jean's 1994 diesel pump had run for 22 consecutive hours without a single hiccup. Moving water through pipe I'd set by hand, keeping 80 acres of corn alive during the worst heat stretch of the summer. Control shouldn't depend on a server. I spent Thursday evening doing the math properly at the kitchen table. Diesel fuel. I burned approximately 40 gallons over the course of the 2-day operation. At current prices, call it $160. Labor, 2 long days of hard physical work, but that's my own time, so I'll count it at a realistic $25 an hour. 12 hours of active work over 2 days equals $300. Total direct cost of running the old pump, roughly $460 in fuel and calculated labor. Now the other side. If I had waited, if I had done what Dale did, what would I have lost? Best case scenario, with 36 hours of no irrigation in 104-degree heat during pollination on sandy soil, 20 bushels per acre lost. That's optimistic given the stress levels I observed. More realistic, 30 to 35 bushels. Call it 30, to be conservative. 80 acres times 30 bushels times $6. $14,400 in reduced revenue versus $460 in fuel and labor. The decision was worth approximately $13,740, and that's using conservative yield loss numbers. Redundancy is insurance you build yourself. Harvest came in mid-September. I run a yield monitor on my combine, so the data is accurate by field section. The sandy 80-acre block on the south averaged 171 bushels per acre. Not my best year on that ground. The heat had taken something, no question, and there was some tip-fill reduction visible when I cracked ears in the field. But 171 was within 7 bushels of my 5-year average on that ground. The manual irrigation had held the crop through the critical window. Dale's numbers on his comparable ground, similar genetics, similar inputs, slightly better soil, came in at 134 bushels per acre. He'd lost the irrigation window at the worst possible time. The crop had pollinated under stress, tip fill was poor across the field, and the yield monitor showed consistent losses in the sections that had gone driest. I'm not saying this to make Dale look bad. He made a reasonable bet. His soil was heavier. The support line had said potentially this afternoon. He had every reason to believe the system would restore in time. That's what the company had built his expectation around. But the server didn't come back until 4:17 p.m. Wednesday, and corn doesn't negotiate. The yield difference on comparable acreage, approximately 37 bushels per acre. Applied to his lighter soil sections, Batur's probably 60 acres, comparable to my situation. That's 2,220 bushels. At $6, that's $13,320 in yield he didn't capture. I don't know if he's doing that math, but I did. The diesel pump is in the front corner of my north shed now, not in the back under canvas. I've serviced it properly. Full mechanical going over, new belts, fresh fluids, new injectors, fuel system cleaned out. I've also built up an aluminum pipe inventory specifically for that 80-acre block, enough to cover the whole field in 2 layouts instead of 3. Reduced my reset time by about 40 minutes. I'm keeping the smart irrigation system. I'm not anti-technology. The cloud platform, when it works, gives me real efficiency gains. The evapotranspiration modeling alone has reduced my total water use. In a normal year, I'm glad I have it. But normal years don't define your risk exposure. Abnormal years do. And in an abnormal year, when a server goes down for 36 hours during a heat wave with no ETA and no manual override, you need something that doesn't require a handshake with a data center to move water. Automation removes friction, but it also removes control. I've been farming for 22 years. Gene farmed this same ground for 35 years before me, and the 20 before that under his father. Between us, we've seen droughts, floods, equipment failures, market collapses, input price spikes, and every kind of bad luck this business can produce. What keeps an operation alive through all of that isn't any single piece of technology. It's redundancy. It's backup systems. It's never letting your entire livelihood depend on one chain that can break in one place. Gene knew that when he bought that diesel pump in 1994, he could have piped everything to the pivots and forgotten about it. Instead, he kept the pump, maintained it, left it in the shed. I almost sold it at an estate auction in 2015. Had it on the list. Took it off at the last minute because I didn't feel like dealing with it that day. I'm glad I didn't deal with it. Would you trust the app when it says everything is normal? Would you walk that field before you trusted it? Would you have a backup when the server goes down with no ETA? I know what I'd tell you. But you have to make that decision for your own operation. Here's what I know for certain. $16,800 of potential yield was at risk on 80 acres during 36 hours that a modern, cloud-authenticated $47,000 smart irrigation system could not function. An old diesel pump, a 30-year-old piece of iron that belonged to a man who's been dead for a decade, closed most of that gap for $460 in fuel and labor. The math doesn't care about convenience. The corn doesn't care about your app's interface. The heat wave doesn't wait for your server to reboot. Control shouldn't depend on a server. That's the only lesson from this story. Not that modern technology is bad, not that old equipment is always the answer. The lesson is simpler and more important than that. Know what happens when your primary system fails. Build your redundancy before you need it, and make sure at least one critical part of your operation can run without asking permission from something you don't control. Because someday, maybe not this year, maybe not next, the server will go down at the wrong time. And when it does, what you have in your shed will matter a great deal more than what you have in your app. Check your shed. If you found this story useful, subscribe so you don't miss the next one, and drop a comment. I want to know, do you have a backup system for your irrigation, or are you running everything through one platform? That conversation is worth having. I'll see you in the next one.